We had to establish a point of reference. You all know what a desert is, right? And you all have seen the pyramids on TV, stuff like that. Okay. We got that point of reference. All right. Our scripture today comes from Exodus chapter 16. Exodus is the second book in the Bible. I would invite you to turn there if you brought your Bibles. Exodus chapter 16, verses 1 through 10. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you've brought us out in this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them to see whether they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us?" Moses also said, "You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses told Aaron, "Say to the entire Israelite community, 'Come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling.'" While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. May God add his blessing to the reading of his holy word. The glory of the Lord appearing in a cloud. Wow. Now some of you, or at least someone out there, I'm guessing, is thinking, if all it takes is a little whining and complaining to see the glory of the Lord, we should see him every day at my house. Or maybe it's just me. Welcome to week 2 as we explore how God provides for the needs of his people, often from some very unlikely sources. Last week, we explored some details about the ministry of the prophet Elijah. And we learned that God provided for him for over 2 years. As he hid beside a brook, the ravens would bring him food and provide for his needs. But our main focus was actually on a widow, a depressed, suicidal widow, a poor, hopeless widow who was about to use her last bit of flour and oil, and then she and her son were going to die. Yet because she was willing to be obedient, bake the bread and give Elijah his portion first. Her faith, we don't know whether it is in the prophet or in the prophet's God, but her faith led to an endless supply of flour and oil. And for over a year, God provided for the needs of Elijah and the widow and her son. And she trusted in the provider and not the provision or the lack of provision. Limited resources, or even no resources, became enough for the day when God's blessing came raining down from heaven. We ended last week contemplating the needs of others and caring for the needs of others out of our scarcity. Maybe an extra quarter or dollar or two given each week and pooled together and then blessed by God. And we ask the question, who knows? What would God do with that? Some of you were even so compelled that you wanted to go ahead and start giving. Even though we don't have it all figured out yet, but you wanted to give in anticipation of what God would do. I mean, who knows? It might just turn into an endless supply of flour and oil. And we still don't have all this figured out. How will we do this, and who will we select, and how will we identify? We don't know, but as we move forward over the next few weeks, we'll we'll clarify that, and we'll figure out how we're going to identify and confidentially meet the needs of someone around us. An endless supply of flour and oil for the widow turned into enough for over a year. Well, the Israelites today, the situation they find themselves in, they don't even have flour and oil. Allow me to put this in context, okay? I tried to with the kids a little bit, but you remember the story of Moses, right? Drawn out of the water, raised in the Pharaoh's palace, killed the Egyptian, ran into the desert. God came to him in a burning bush and said, I've chosen you, desert rat Moses, after 40 years in the desert, to go back into Egypt and bring all of my people out. And if you remember the whole story, maybe we'll do a series on it sometime. It's really cool. But God really had to convince Moses, because he came up with excuse after excuse after excuse as to why he couldn't. I mean, after all, it made perfect sense, right? Go in and tell the king of Egypt, the most powerful man in the free world and the not free world, that his slave labor, his labor supply, was going to be released without a fight. Just let him go. Makes sense, right? So, of course, Pharaoh refused, right? Pharaoh refused, but God was really convincing. And remember, he sent the 10 plagues. And then the angel of death visited Egypt, killing the firstborn in every household, except for the Israelites. Because remember, they had spread the blood of the Passover lamb, which is where the Jewish tradition of Passover comes in. The death angel passed over their household. And in the middle of the night, Pharaoh said, get these people and this curse out of my country. And so somewhere between 500,000 to 3 million Jews left Egypt. And there's some argument about how many, and I'm not sure that how many is really relevant for my brain, because it was a lot. A lot. More than I can picture. Clarification here, though, as we go through this, okay? Anytime we talk about the Hebrew people, the Israelites, the Jews, God's chosen people, we're talking about the same group of people, okay? Sometimes that gets confusing because they're interchangeable, and depending on which book of the Bible you read, kind of depends on who you will, how they're referred to. But these are the people that God promised Abraham. I will make you the father of a great nation, okay? And then Isaac was the son of promise, the son of laughter, who had a son Jacob, who wrestled with God, and God changed his name to Israel, and that's where we get the Israelites, okay? So those are all the same people. So Pharaoh sends these people out in the middle of the night, but he changes his mind. I mean, after all, his labor force was leaving Egypt. His free labor force was leaving Egypt. And he sent his army after them. And we know the story that the Israelites found themselves between a rock and a hard place, or literally between the Egyptian army, the most powerful army in the world, and the Red Sea. What were they going to do? But we know that Moses held out his hand, and God parted the waters of the Red Sea. And where there was no way, they crossed over on dry ground. And then as the Egyptian army poured in behind them, God closed the water back up. And we know that the water was deep enough, powerful enough, strong enough that the Egyptian army was destroyed. Wow. That is a miracle. There is no other explanation than that is a miracle. God made a way where there was no way. Miraculous event that we are now only 2 months removed from. And these people seem to have a very, very short memory. And they're starting to complain. A lot. All the time. They're out in the desert, the wilderness, if you will, and saying things like, Moses, you've brought us out into the wilderness to die. I mean, in Egypt we were slaves, but at least we were well-fed slaves. I mean, we may have worked 12 hours a day, but at least the 1 or 2 hours we got to rest, we could sit around a pot full of meat and vegetables. I mean, we may have gotten regular beatings, but we were not hungry. All right? What have you done to us, Moses? Why did we listen to you at all? I mean, we were in captivity. Life was hard. But it wasn't this hard. At least we ate. Why don't you just take us back to Egypt? Wine, 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 wine. God parted the Red Sea. You saw it. You were part of the miracle. And I'm thinking there's a plan here. But 2 months of hardship, 2 months of uncertainty have created your short memory. But God was patient and loving, unlike most of us. God was patient and loving. And he said, you, my people, you need a reminder of my goodness. You need visible evidence that I even exist. And you need to be certain that I have a plan for you. I want you to trust in the provider and not the provision. So, we're told in the passage we read today, God rained bread down from heaven every morning and manna, meat, in the evening. And he gave him instructions. You're supposed to gather just enough for today. Just enough for today. But on the sixth day, we're getting to the Sabbath. On the sixth day, gather enough for 2 days. And prepare it, and it'll be there tomorrow. Some people didn't obey and were told that they found out the next morning that the bread was moldy or the meat was rancid. Because God wanted them to trust in the provision or into the provider and not the provision. Trust that he would do it again and again and again and again. And he did so for 40 years. And we're not talking about God multiplying resources like flour and oil. We're talking about creating resources where there were none to begin with. Because that's what he does, right? We believe that he created out of the foundation of the earth. He created from nothing. He breathed life into living creatures, you and me. And we believe that that's what he did with Elijah. That's what he did with the Israelites. But it's tough for us to believe that he can still do that today. That he would create out of nothing something. But you need to hear that God has infinite resources. God's resources are boundless. They are without end. I mean, it would stand to reason that if, for you philosophers, or really academic people, if God can create out of nothing, his resources are infinite, right? They're without end. But yet we tend to not believe that because we have a very short memory like the Israelites. Now, I want you to hear two things from that today. If you're wondering how you are going to make it because you've reached the end of your rope, God is able to meet your needs. I don't always know how. I don't know through whom or through what, but God is able. Maybe not to excess, okay? Maybe not to excess, and maybe just enough for today, but God is able. Second thing is that if you're worried about having enough and fear releasing some of your resources to God, God is able to replenish and even multiply what you have left, as well as multiply what you don't even have, if that makes sense. God has infinite resources. His resources are boundless. They are without end. Now, disclaimer here, okay? Because I know some people frugal like me. Do not think Pastor Chris told us that we don't need to save our money, okay? Because that's not what I'm saying. I believe that God is for his people being good stewards of their resources. And wise money management is rooted in biblical principles, okay? I'm for being prepared for the unexpected, saving, an emergency fund, planning for the future. I'm for all that, but, here's the but. When saving becomes hoarding out of fear that God cannot provide for the future, I think it becomes sin. Hoarding to excess is a poor use of God's resources. You remember the story of the talents, right? There was one who hid the single talent God gave him. And he buried it for fear that he would lose it. And God was very clear. He said, I didn't give it to you to hide out of fear. I gave you that to invest so that I could multiply it. Example of this, if you go into most of our cabinets, on our worst day, okay? If you go into my cabinets on our worst day, you know the day when the kids walk in and they open the fridge, we have absolutely nothing to eat in here. There is nothing to eat in here. And then, when are you going to go to the store? But then you take an inventory of what we actually have. We probably have 2 or 3 weeks worth of food. Maybe it's stuff they actually have to cook. I don't know. But most of us, throw more away than a lot of people ever have to begin with. So the goal is not to make you feel guilty here, okay? Do not do that. I don't think God is a God of guilt, okay? It's to speak the truth in love. And the truth is most of us can be better stewards of what we have. We can stretch our resources, trusting that God will provide more without fear, okay? So we can share just a little out of our scarcity, all right? Doing without the cup of coffee one day a week, or not getting dessert when we go out to eat at a restaurant, you know, that type of sacrificial act. I'm not talking about taking, an extra $1 or $2 and putting it in a plate. We're talking completely separate, right? This flour and oil fund would be completely separate. Outside of the church budget, not a tract. We'll keep track of it, but not a multiplying thing that goes in the budget and we decide. This would be a separate fund with the sole purpose of blessing the lives of individuals, either in our midst or somehow associated with our church family. Either meeting a very real need, or maybe just reminding someone that God has not forgotten about them. And somehow by giving an extra quarter or nickel or dollar or 20, and then we pool it together and we multiply it week after week, after a couple of weeks, we have enough to bless someone's life. And you could be a part of a miracle. A miracle. Now, some of you are thinking, that's a little bit of an over-exaggeration, isn't it? I mean, a miracle. That's not really what's going on here. Whenever I was in seminary, I had a professor who was from Kenya. I love to listen to him talk, by the way. Completely nothing to do with the story. But I love to listen to him talk because he spoke the Queen's English, okay? He spoke the Queen's English, and he was my philosophy professor. And I'm having lunch with Dr. Okello in the cafeteria one day. And I'm sharing with him about my daughter Amanda's senior project, okay? And I'm telling him that she's having an event that will raise money for this scholarship program in Kenya through a Methodist church in northern Indiana. And they will raise money, and then it will be sent to provide scholarships for kids in Kenya. Now, we're not talking university or college scholarships. We're talking elementary school scholarships. Many of these kids came from just horrific situations. Some of them had been left by their parents. Some of them had nowhere to go. And for a couple $100, they could be fed, clothed, and given an education. And so Amanda is putting this event together and trying to raise a few dollars. And he looks at me and he says, that is a miracle. I said, it's just a few $100. Maybe $1,000. How is that going to be a miracle? And he said, when kids in my country, they have no hope, and they pray to God that somehow the Creator will lift them out of their poverty, will somehow change their situation for the better. And a person who they don't even know from halfway around the world sends money, and all of a sudden they get fed, clothed, and educated. That is a miracle. Manna from heaven. And your daughter, and the people who are giving to that, they are participating in a miracle provided by the hand of God's people. And I was like, wow, how could I have been so blind? How could I have dismissed the extravagant generosity of such a small act and the impact that it would have on a life that is void of all hope? God reminded me that day. And I've been blessed to sit across the table from fathers that they share with me how they are not going to be able to pay their rent, let alone provide food for their family, or to hold the hand of single mothers who are swallowed up by medical bills and they're working 2 jobs and they have no hope of even paying their children's lunch money that week. And I've been privileged to listen to a wife whose husband's incarcerated tell me how she can't pay her tuition for college this year, trying to make a better life for her family. I've been humbled as a senior adult shares with me that they have memory issues and they've been the victim of some sort of scam, and part of their savings is now gone, and they wonder how they're going to put groceries in their cabinet, put gas in their car, and buy their prescription drugs. And I say blessed and privileged and humbled because I got the benefit of telling them that God had not forgotten about them. That through the generosity of God's people, that they were going to be receiving a gift. Maybe we couldn't take care of all their needs, but they were going to receive a gift that they were not to repay, that there were no strings attached. It did not require X number of Sundays a year at church or giving to this or that. It was a gift with no strings attached. The only condition was that they were not to pay it back. But if somewhere down the road they found themselves blessed, they would certainly be welcome to give a little back. To tell them, take heart. Don't be afraid. God has not forgotten about you. It's humbling. It's brought tears to my eyes over and over again to experience the joy of God meeting the needs, of being a miracle for some people. We can't help everyone, right? But we can help one. And I would invite you not to be overcome by the magnitude of the need, to the point that you're paralyzed and say, what would my extra nickel or quarter or dollar do? Because that's what happens with a lot of us. The need's so great we just don't know where to begin, so we just do just that. We don't begin. But God can multiply our little bit of flour and oil to excess. God can rain down bread from heaven. God is able. And most of the time, I've come to realize that miracles occur through the hands of God's people. They occur through the hands of God's people. And we get to participate in that. We may not know all the details because confidentiality is key, but knowing that we can actually participate in that, to me, that's humbling and it's overwhelming. So I would invite you and me, let's just pray about this. Just pray about it and see what God does. Just quietly open our eyes and our ears and our hearts and quietly pray about it and see if God doesn't answer. Quietly pray about it and see what God can do through Hillside. And let's try to do for one what we wish we could do for everyone.